and welcome to day 3 of the 7th day ox. It's been a good story. This man is very, very faithful, and we're going to see even more of that as we move along. So let's jump right in into chapter 7 and see what happens to Nikolai today. Nikolai sat bolt upright on the wooden boards of the bed where he lay sleeping. He tried to clear the fog from his tired mind to make sense of his surroundings. Where was he? What was he doing here? On your feet, men. We don't have all day to lie around spinning dreams. There's work to be done. On your feet. Nikolai heard a crash and then a groan just a few feet away. He turned on his bed to see a pile of boards from one of the bunks and a man underneath them. Above him towered a guard, with shafts of dusty morning sunlight streaming through the open doorway behind him. Now Nikolai remembered where he was. The guard strode to where Nikolai was lying, but Nikolai scrambled to his feet and to attention before the guard could take a swipe at him too. "That's better," growled the guard in what Nikolai imagined must be a tone of satisfaction. "You've got 30 seconds to line up in front of the cabin. Better yet, let's see you make it in 20. Without a second thought, Nikolai dashed out into the early morning sun, now already well above the northeastern horizon. Even so, the hour was still early. Nikolai figured it couldn't be more than 5 or 5:30 in the morning. He squinted at the brightness of the sun and wondered how the sun could rise so early this far north. But of course, with the tilt of the Earth's axis during the summer months, places this far north had more daylight than cities farther south like Moscow or Kiev back home. When the guard came back out of the barracks, Nikolai was still trying to button his shirt and straighten his trousers. It was good, but that he had boots to wear, not shoes that had to be laced up, or he wouldn't have made it out into the courtyard this fast with all his clothes on. Nikolai glanced down at his appearance. It was true that his clothes weren't on completely straight, and his shirt wasn't buttoned up all the way, but he was relieved to know that he had somehow managed to straighten himself up in the few seconds the guard had allowed him. Again, Nikolai tried to shake the fog from his eyes and mind. There was no way to escape the reality of his surroundings. He was in a prison camp somewhere in Siberia at the end of a long train ride from the west. And one thing was sure. If he was going to survive this place of desolation at the ends of the earth, he was going to have to learn to get up on time. Actually, getting up well before he was called would be better. This was his first morning in camp, and it seemed that he was expected to know everything about the rules and regulations of the place. But Nikolai was quickly learning that one rule seemed to overshadow all others. Never be late. He struggled to think positive thoughts as he stood at attention in the row of prisoners lined up in front of the barracks. The idea of having to do this every morning for the next 5 years, 10 years, or however long it took the KGB authorities to figure they had punished him enough, was almost more than he could bear. "For being late, you boys can skip breakfast this morning," the guard barked. "That'll teach you to sleep in." No one moved. "Well, what are you waiting for?" he growled as the prisoners stared back at him. "You have your work details. Get to your assignments. You three," he suddenly added, pointing at Nikolai and the other 2 new prisoners. "The warden wants to see you immediately." The 3 of them looked at one another with raised eyebrows, but when the guard turned and walked away, they shrugged and simply headed for the administrative building. Nikolai thought it strange that the men in his barracks had been caught sleeping in. Weren't they used to camp life? And weren't they used to getting up this early every morning? Or was this just a show of force for Nikolai and the other new prisoners? And why weren't he and the others being escorted to the warden's quarters? The whole thing seemed kind of strange, but then Nikolai remembered how informal the place was. People were just expected to go about their business and do their jobs, he guessed. Nikolai was the last of the 3 to be called into the warden's office. As he stood at attention outside in the hallway, he wondered what went on in these kinds of prisons. What should he expect? Would he be interrogated again? Would he be mistreated because he was a Christian? When Nikolai finally stood in the warden's office, he was surprised at how simple the place appeared. Though the warden was a colonel in the Russian army, there was almost nothing in his office to dress it up. A medium-sized oak desk, 3 chairs, a lone kerosene lamp, and a few books on a dusty bookshelf. After studying an official letter that had been sent him via the mailbag on the train, the warden cleared his throat. You had a run-in with the KGB. Nikolai waited. Nothing since the warden's statement. Nothing since the warden's statement was more commentary than anything. Oh, and said nothing. Nikolai waited, but said nothing, since the warden's statement was more commentary than anything. Nikolai Panchuk, the warden, put the official letter back in his folder on the desk. I've got no use for preachers. As far as I'm concerned, you preachers are all just a bunch of rebels. The warden brought his fist down on the desk with a bang. You think you can change the world, he groaned. Well, I've got news for you. The motherland is fine the way she is. The Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, is the greatest nation the world has ever known. She doesn't need any help. The warden squinted at Nikolai through slit eyes. Do you understand that, Panchuk? Yes, sir. Even though Nikolai was a Christian and didn't agree with the tactics the government used, he was still proud to be a citizen of the USSR. It made his chest swell just to hear the national anthem or see athletes competing for the glory of the motherland. The officer leaned back in his chair. I'll tell you what, Panchuk. He seemed a bit cool. Let's forget about what it was that got you here in the first place. If you follow my orders in this camp, I'll not give you any trouble. We'll let bygones be bygones. What do you say to that? The warden began sorting through some other papers on his desk. Nikolai wondered whether the warden fully understood the charges being brought against him. He had to, didn't he? The man had Nikolai's file. Did he know about the secret churches? Would he be expecting Nikolai to give him the list of church members? Of course, Nikolai knew he would never give such a list to the warden, not even if the warden should beat him, not even if the warden should kill him. But of course the warden didn't know that. Nikolai wondered if he should just bring up the subject and get it all out in the open now. On the other hand, maybe he should just let the warden figure it out for himself. I want to cooperate, sir. Nikolai's face was solid as he stood at attention and stared straight ahead. The warden stood to his feet suddenly. Good, Nikolai. I'm glad to hear that. A slight grin edged the corners of his mouth. Now I'm sending you to the wood shop. You'll be working with Vadim, the camp carpenter. Lots of work to do around here, he announced. And remember, Panchuk, he added as he pointed the way for Nikolai, follow orders and you and I will get along just fine. All right, chapter 8. Nikolai couldn't believe his ears. That was it? No interrogation? No grilling to get long sought-after information from the preacher? This was too good to be true. It couldn't be that easy, and Nikolai was sure that there would be future confrontations. As he turned to go, Nikolai suddenly remembered his biggest problem of all, the Sabbath. He would be required to work during Sabbath hours. That's what happened when you were a prisoner. Nikolai wondered, should he say something about it now, or wait until Saturday when the Sabbath would actually become an issue? Instinctively, Nikolai knew he'd better take care of it immediately while he still had the courage and the warden's attention. Sir, Nikolai stopped and turned around. There is one thing that may be a problem. But already the warden had moved on to other things. Remember, Panchuk, no problems. Simply obey orders, and you and I will get along fine. Nikolai stood a few moments longer, wondering what he should do, but he realized there was no use pressing the issue now. The warden was in no mood to listen, and maybe it wasn't the right time for such a discussion anyway. God had his own timetable as to when these things should be taken care of, Nikolai mused. He knew he'd better let God work out everything as he saw best. Help me to know when that time is, he prayed silently. Nikolai went looking for Vadim and found him in the wood shop. The camp carpenter still had the pungent odor of garlic on his breath, and the smell of it made Nikolai ravenous. Garlic was one of his favorite foods, and knowing that he had been deprived of breakfast made it twice as hard to go to work and wait for the midday meal. But Vadim had plenty for Nikolai to do, and that made him almost forget the grumbling, growling feeling in his stomach. The mess hall needed more wooden benches made. Then there were the few boards in the floor of the administrative headquarters that needed to be replaced, and a door at the mess hall needed mending. Lunch finally came. It was a simple one, but Nikolai didn't care. He was just glad to get something warm into his stomach. The cook had made borscht with beets, onions, and cabbage in it. It was the most heavenly food Nikolai could remember tasting, and the Russian black bread tasted like cake to Nikolai after his days on the train with so little to eat. That afternoon, Vadim told Nikolai they needed to repair some of the large wooden water barrels sitting near the kitchen. Each barrel held about 50 gallons of water and was made with oak staves. Nikolai had to tip them on their side to roll them back to the wood shop where Vadim would be making the repairs. On his trip back for the second barrel, Nikolai noticed that an ox cart had pulled up at the kitchen. The cart held 2 large wooden barrels filled with water, hauled from a spring located more than a kilometer away. Oleg, the driver of the ox cart, was shouting at the ox, trying to get him to pull the cart forward a bit more so the water could be hauled into the kitchen. But the ox wouldn't budge a step further. Maybe the ox was tired from hauling the water, and maybe he was just being plain stubborn, or maybe he was weary of the treatment he had been receiving from the driver. At any rate, it was obviously a showdown, and it seemed both the driver and ox were determined to win. When the driver pulled out his leather prod and began to whip the ox in the face, Nikolai sprang into action. He knew it probably wasn't wise to get involved since this was only his first day in camp, but he couldn't bear to see the animal being mistreated. "Hold on," he called to the driver. "It's obvious the ox is too stubborn for his own good. Why don't we try something else?" Nikolai tried not to look at the driver. He was butting in where he might not be wanted, but he felt that he had to try. "What's his name?" Nikolai asked nonchalantly as he stepped up to the ox and gave the animal a pat on his thick, muscled neck. "Maxim, I guess," the prisoner replied. "I never use that name, but I guess it's his name." "Animals are like people," Nikolai said. "They like to be convinced to do something, not beaten into submission." Nikolai patted the ox's neck again and leaned forward to whisper something into its ear. Then he took hold of a halter around the ox's neck and pulled forward as he continued talking to the ox. The technique did the trick. In a matter of seconds, the ox had pulled the cart a few meters forward so the driver could unload the barrels and put them on pallets outside the kitchen. That night, after the evening meal, Nikolai went to the stables where he found Maxim quietly munching on tundra marsh grass. Nikolai sat down beside the big animal and watched him eat. He felt sorry for him. In some ways, he thought he understood how Maxim must feel. The ox's job was to work every day, day in and day out, week after week, with no break. That seemed to be his only purpose in life. And he was a prisoner like Nikolai. He was not his own boss. He couldn't come and go as he pleased. His job was to haul water from the spring, and it probably would be until the day that he died. After that first evening visit with Maxim, Nikolai stopped by the stables every night to bring the ox a little something from the kitchen. Sometimes it was a beet or a wedge of cabbage. Sometimes it was just a small carrot. But it was the talks that he had with Maxim that helped Nikolai the most. Nikolai was sure that he was getting much more from the visits than Maxim was, but the animal seemed to enjoy the company. The one-sided conversations helped Nikolai deal with the pain of being so far from home. When he felt he was going to panic from the loneliness that threatened to overwhelm him, old Maxim would look at him with his big brown eyes and just listen. And so a relationship began to grow between Nikolai and Maxim. It was a wonderful tonic for Nikolai's spirit, and it helped him deal with the discouragement of those first few days in camp. All right, I think we have time for Chapter 9. As the week progressed, Nikolai knew the Sabbath problem wasn't going to go away. He was going to have to face it. Several times he wondered how he should break the news to the warden, but there seemed to be no good way to do it, and no good time either. The warden kept to himself and didn't invite many visitors to his office. One thing was sure. He had Nikolai's file in his office, and sooner or later it would probably be used against him. The Sabbath hadn't been a specific problem on Nikolai's record. The thing that had gotten him into trouble had been his unwillingness to cooperate with the KGB and give them a list of his church members. But would the Sabbath be a problem now? Nikolai could hardly imagine that it wouldn't, since the warden had reminded him that obeying the camp rules was extremely important, and Nikolai hadn't heard that there were any days off for rest or recreation. As Thursday and then Friday came, Nikolai knew a showdown was imminent. On Sabbath morning, long before the roosters were crowing over in the chicken coop, Nikolai was up, restless and waiting for the will of God to be revealed. "What is it you have in store for me?" Nikolai whispered as he knelt in the early morning shadows of the sod barracks. "I know you want me to be your witness, and I know I may have to suffer for your sake. But how am I to know your plans for me?" But the voice of God was strangely silent, and Nikolai knew that this was one of those times when he would simply have to wait for God to lead. When he heard the other prisoners in his barracks begin to stir, he knew the time was fast approaching, and since God had not told him what to do, Nikolai made a decision. He would go out for roll call, but not to breakfast or his work assignment. After roll call, he would return to the barracks to fast and pray. Come what may, this was his decision, and he would stick by it. And that was it. It was as though God had been waiting for Nikolai to make a decision about the Sabbath and then act on it. It was this moment of decision that gave Nikolai the confidence he had been lacking all week. Suddenly he could see things clearly, as though a window of opportunity had opened. He was standing on the threshold of another great moment in his life. He sensed that things were going to be very hard for him now that he had made up his mind, but he wanted to go through with it anyway. After roll call, he did exactly as he had planned. He returned to the barracks, knelt down again on the hard dirt floor by his bunk, and began to pray. And every moment that passed took him closer to the inevitable confrontation he knew was coming. But it didn't come as soon as he had expected, and he should have guessed as much. No one would know that he hadn't shown up for his work assignment except Vadim, and the carpenter might simply think that Nikolai had been asked to work somewhere else for the day. But finally, the moment of truth arrived. About mid-morning, Nikolai heard one of the guards outside talking to another prisoner. "Where's Panchuk?" a gravelly voice demanded. "I haven't seen him," came the reply. It was almost noon before Nikolai was finally discovered in the barracks, and when he was, it seemed the whole world was caving in. "What have you been doing here?" the guard demanded. "Are you sick?" Nikolai knew that if he said he was sick, they might let him off for the day. But that wouldn't fix the problem. The following week, he would be in the barracks again, and the likelihood of his being sick 2 Sabbaths in a row would certainly be cause for suspicion. Nikolai knew he needed to deal with the Sabbath issue now. He needed to face this problem head on no matter what the consequences. It was the only way. "I'm not sick," Nikolai said plainly, getting to his feet. "Then why are you in here?" the guard asked incredulously, as though expecting some sort of ridiculous answer. And he got one. "I can't work today because it's the 7th-day Sabbath of the Lord my God." "The 7th day, what?" the guard yelled, standing stock still. "The 7th-day Sabbath is God's holy day, his holy Sabbath, and I'm forbidden to work on it. The Bible is very—" "The Bible!" Nikolai was cut short by the guard. It was obvious the guard hadn't seen this coming, and it gave Nikolai a chance to take the explanation a bit further. "The Bible is God's holy word, and in it he tells me I should worship him on the 7th-day Sabbath in honor of the world's creation." Nikolai would have liked to say more, but he knew the guard would never let him finish, and he was right. "I don't know what you're talking about," the guard interrupted again, finally getting his bearings. "It doesn't matter what day it is. We work every day around here. On your feet, Panchuk. I won't have any slackers in this barracks." But Nikolai made no move to go, and this infuriated the guard even more. "I'll teach you to disobey orders," he shouted again, his face turning purple with rage. He pulled a nightstick from his belt and began to beat Nikolai on the head and shoulders. Nikolai didn't have time to do anything but cover his head with his arms and hands. It hurt, but he was able to deflect the worst blows of the beating. "Now get to your work assignment," the guard shouted. "Vadim is looking for you." Both Nikolai and the guard were breathing hard by now, but Nikolai still made no move to go. "I'm sorry, but I can't work," Nikolai repeated the words repeatedly. "It's forbidden for me to work on God's holy day." At this, the guard let loose with a steady stream of curses and began to beat Nikolai mercilessly with his fists. Then he grabbed Nikolai by his shirt collar and dragged him out the door into the barracks courtyard. By now the commotion was so great that other prisoners were looking towards them to see what the noise was all about. "We'll see about this 7-day holy Sabbath of yours," he shouted uncontrollably. "We'll just take you to the warden and see what he says about all this. He'll know what to do with the likes of you. And that brings us to the end of chapter 9. So we'll pause there for now, but we'll see you tomorrow for more of the Seventh Day Ox.